what is the goal for fighting noise? Quiet is the goal that many people will talk about, and I personally still feel is a precious and worthwhile goal. But I started to think there must be more to it than simply reducing the decibels around us.
Hello, welcome to Cambridge Forum, coming to you live via Zoom. I'm Mary Stack, the Executive Director. Today we're examining clamor, how our ever noisier world is affecting our mental and physical health, as well as the lives of other species on the planet. Yes, hard to believe, but back in 1906, Julia Barnett Rice, a New York physician, musician, and mother of six, busy person, founded the Society of Unnecessary Noise to counter the noise of tugboat whistles on the Hudson River. Well, good luck with fighting to decide what constitutes unnecessary noise in New York City today, or anywhere for that matter. So we all think we know what we mean by noise, and there are some commonalities, certainly. Aircraft noise, road construction, car alarms. But beyond that, we don't all agree. Have you been to a big concert venue recently, or found yourself stuck in a busy, noisy bar or restaurant? Noise is a tricky pollutant to pin down and measure beyond the decibel measurement, as it's both ephemeral and it's also personal. However, today we've got Chris Berdik, science and education journalist, who was captivated by the idea of a pollutant which has such wide-ranging harms to mental and physical well-being, both pervasive and inscrutable, but some regard as harmful as secondhand smoke, whilst others regard it as a kind of Luddite reaction of not much importance. Anyway, Chris researched and wrote a new book, and we're going to talk about that today, what he found out. The book is Clamor: How Noise Took Over the World and How We Can Take It Back. And he's going to help us navigate around some of the notions about noise. Okay, Chris, welcome, and thanks for taking the time.
Thanks so much, Mary. It's great to be here.
So, congratulations on the book. It's very interesting. It covers an awful lot of ground. Tell me the history of how you got involved in this topic. I think there was a pre-pandemic and a post-pandemic kind of trajectory to this.
Yes, that's right. I started work on this with a Boston Globe Sunday Magazine article about a public health researcher at Harvard who was focused on noise pollution. Prior to that, I hadn't really thought much about noise pollution other than when it was personally bothering me, which I think is kind of the way a lot of people interact with noise. But I found reading the epidemiology how many aspects of our health are affected by noise, from not just our hearing, but cardiovascular disease, from our mental health, hypertension, the risk of stroke, the risk of dementia, and depression. And I thought this is such a pervasive health impact from a pollutant that nobody can really agree what it is. And that started my interest in it. And I wrote a few more magazine articles on the topic and decided it was worthy of a book idea, and Norton agreed. We had the book contract in place at the end of 2019, and I was ready to go out and report on this pollutant when the pandemic hit and everything shut down. All my reporting had to be canceled. As everyone will remember, cities emptied out, the roads cleared, schools shut down, businesses closed, people stayed home. And a side effect of all of that was a sudden quiet. Places where scientists measured this, it was maybe 4 to 6 decibels reduction. People started to hear more birds. People thought, are there more birds around, or am I just able to hear them better? And of course, it's the latter. Fewer cars on the streets and fewer airplanes flying through the sky also lowered the decibels. And because I wasn't doing my planned reporting, I was doing a lot more reading and thinking about this topic. And the thing I thought about a lot was this quieter world that we had ushered in through this catastrophe. Uh, People took a lot of solace in some of the quiet moments that they had, but it was impossible to disconnect this quiet from what had brought it about. The not only economic devastation, but of course, the health and the sickness and the dying. And it made me think about what is the goal for fighting noise? Quiet is the goal that many people will talk about, and I personally still feel is a precious and worthwhile goal. But I started to think there must be more to it than simply reducing the decibels around us. That what we want from our soundscapes is more than just having them be quieter. We have soundscapes that we are in when we're working, when we are socializing, when we are under the care of physicians in hospitals, when we're at school, and all of these soundscapes can make those places function better or worse. And I started to think and talk to people who look at sound that way, who look at how soundscapes actually impact our lives for better or for worse, and that improving those soundscapes is probably a broader and more all-encompassing goal.
It's very interesting you say that because when you think about sounds in your life, you think perhaps back to your childhood. There's a lot of emotion and nostalgia attached to certain sounds, um, and you don't realize how much till you revisit the sound. And it could be a particular bird you always heard as a child, and you hear it again, and it brings a lot of memories up. With me, I always remember in the background, there was always Radio 4 on. And there was something incredibly reassuring about the voices of people on Radio 4, no matter what was going on in the country. There was this kind of constancy, this is secure, it was trustworthy. And, I never equated it with any value till I was away for years away from it. So I wonder if the subjectivity of certain sounds in people's life is that individual to do with how you were raised and the things that were familiar to you.
Yeah, I think it is. And I think some of the folks who work on hearing, for instance, who have, I think, had more success in trying to get people to protect their hearing, focus on what the hearing really means to these individuals. And it varies. So the way hearing is tested is by measuring our ear's ability to sense beeps at certain
Mhm.
frequencies and certain decibels. But when we start to lose our hearing, we don't care about losing frequencies and beeps. We care about all the sounds that have meaning to us, the people who we want to converse with that we can no longer hear in noisy places. The audiologist who runs the Dangerous Decibels program started to ask her patients, what is your favorite sound?
Mm.
Rather than simply warning them about losing their hearing and telling them that they were at 40 decibels with certain frequency range or 35 decibels, she started to kind of hone in on what the hearing and what those connections were and what hearing actually meant to them.
Well, I would like to extend that invitation to the audience. I'd like them to type in, if they like, in the chat there, what is their very favorite sound and what is their least favorite sound? What sound really drives them mad? Because this is when we discover that it's pretty personal, the things that you like and you don't like. So in the book, you say that sound is neither good nor bad, but, quote, although our reactions to specific sounds are subjective, the experience of being stressed by noise is universal and underpinned by the hardwired connections we all share. So this suggests it's something we should be taking much more seriously.
Right. So the phrase that I use to describe this is that our reactions to sound are subjective, but they're not arbitrary. And if you look at a statistic like the European Environment Agency uh, tracks the impact of noise on cardiovascular health. And this is an indirect connection through a stress response. But they estimate that it is linked to 40 to 50,000 new cases of heart disease across the continent every year.
Wow.
So we are stressed by many different types of noises individually. That does vary, but there are certain things that connect us as humans. Not only are the anatomy of our inner ears, which has certain vulnerabilities to decibels, but we have these hair trigger connections between our hearing and our fight or flight response.
Mhm.
We have only so much attentional bandwidth that when we are trying to navigate through difficult task at work, and there's all of our coworkers are talking about their weekends, or there's a Zoom call in the next cubicle over. We have limitations there, and that will stress us out. And a lot of these stresses go unmeasured, uh, but they do measure in epidemiology. They will measure transportation noise and its impacts, often through disrupted sleep.
Mm.
They can measure this on kind of a large geographic scale. And what they'll find, a typical study will find that for every 10 decibel increase in nighttime noise exposure, you'll get about an 8% or so increase in the risk of heart disease. So
Wow.
what they measure, when they measure it, they find these connections in a sort of a broad swath of different of people who have different kind of subjective likes and dislikes with their sound worlds, but we do share these kind of um, basic human hardwiring.
Hardwire, right. So the American Public Health Association has identified noise as a health hazard, and it says it leads to heart disease, hearing loss, and other associated health impacts. But there seems to be a bit of a denial in the general population about the scale of the problem. And in the book, you say that there are industries where, like construction, where workers are meant to wear earphones, protective earphones, and they don't. And also, we'll happily go along and get our eyes checked. But a lot of people are resistant, and I know this firsthand from people I know, friends, very resistant to getting their ears checked. Now, I don't understand that. Is there a kind of reason for that?
I think for a lot of people, well, I will say, I'll stipulate that we do, our hearing does degrade naturally as we age. And none of the researchers whom I interviewed could say, oh, 10% of your hearing loss is due to aging, 90% is due to noise exposure, or some other ratio. It's unknown, but it is known that the more noise exposure you have, the faster you will lose your hearing. So there is a combination there, but people, I think, generally just latch on to this idea that losing your hearing is something that's going to happen as you grow old, just like graying hair or wrinkles. And so why should you get so upset about it, preemptively? It is a slow process. Normally, you don't lose it all at once. You lose it bit by bit by bit. That is kind of a hard thing to get exercised about, and it's an indirect when it comes to the stress connection. It's an indirect harm, and I think people just generally
Mm,
have had a hard time kind of even talking about chronic, no matter what the sources of it are, grappling with it as a health hazard has been something that is, it's been hard to do, let alone kind of zeroing in on noise as the source.
So, we've got some feedback from people in the audience here. Lots of people have a consensus on
Mhm.
leaf blowers being the noisiest and irksome of sounds. Then good ones, sound of my baby breathing, the ocean, music, what you'd expect. Then somebody else put Christmas carols, hated, especially the little drummer boy during Christmas. That's a bar humbug person right there. Okay, so let's look at some of the effects that you talk about, because you go to great detail in the book about some of the things that I was surprised that have been tracked. There's hard evidence to prove the correlation, and there's nothing done about it. And I'm going to talk about this right now with noise and disruption of our attention, degrading educational performance at school. So you say in the book, when classroom noise goes up, test scores go down. Flight noise at only 55 decibels lowers reading and math scores. I can attest to that because I went to school right near London Airport, Heathrow Airport, and it was estimated we lost a third of our time in class due to aircraft noise. And it was so loud you couldn't even speak, never mind hear the teacher. So, so there's a good reason why libraries are traditionally quiet zones, right? There's some sense
Yes.
there.
And I think noise can affect learning in a couple of ways. Uh, because noise will mask what the teacher is saying, just by what we would call energetic masking. So this is just you can't hear the words that your teacher is saying at all because it's too loud otherwise. And that could be from airplane noise flying overhead. I think a lot of schools I've heard when they're near airports the teachers has to stop teaching
Mm,
while the airplane is going overhead. So you
yeah,
get, less time for the
lost that.
lessons.
Yeah.
Um, but then there's also something called informational masking. So this is not sound overpowering the whatever your teacher is saying, but maybe another student is talking and your brain, any human's brain is a kind of a pattern seeking machine, and it will latch on to intelligible speech and it will try to make sense of it. And if it's trying to latch onto too many pieces of intelligible speech, it will not be able to pay attention to the one
Mm.
that matters, which is coming from the teacher. So there are both ways that sound in a school can disrupt learning.
So that definitely is one. You've got some interesting comments from Professor Nina Kraus, who's a neurobiologist in Northwestern. She's written a book, we've got the link in there, called Of Sound Mind. And she argues that noise not only delays reading proficiency, but hinders a wide range of learning because the brain's sound processing networks are wired into broad cognitive abilities such as attention and working memory. And she says we need to be more cavalier about the day-to-day commotion that surrounds us in our raucous world. I thought that was a good word, for the sake of our brains. So this sounded like a pretty serious call to arms here,
Yeah.
that for the sake of our brain health, we need to be doing something.
What she looks at is the way that our brain's auditory processing is sort of a hub of connection with the brain plasticity of learning, connecting a sound with meaning, with memory, connecting it with our emotional response, setting up all of these neural connections and making them efficient and stronger when that incoming signal is noisy and corrupted, that that will slow that process down. That will degrade that process. I won't go any further into the neuroscience of it. I think her book is fantastic and it is geared towards, a lay audience. So I recommend checking that out.
One thing that I've noticed, apart from noisy libraries now where you can't get the quiet that you used to, there seems to be a general sort of disrespect for the fact that it is meant to be a cloistered environment to help people concentrate. You also see kids now on their phones, meant to be reading. Sometimes they've got headphones on as well with music. And you just know that this cannot possibly be good for the very reasons you're saying, that you're asking the brain to do something it can't do. It has to decide, right? And I often wonder, I've no stats to back this up, but I wonder if there's any relationship between this great number of people that supposedly have attention deficit disorder and the fact that they're manifesting what, in fact, we all have in our current world, which is the inability to zone out the noise. It's just so difficult to, even in movies, you go to a movie to see a movie, you go to a concert to see a concert, and you got people with their technology, recording, talking on top of all the other stuff going on. And I just wonder where that whole fantasy came from, that one stimuli is not enough, or stimulus.
That's an excellent question. And I also don't have any statistics on it, but I do know how many people I have read who talk about the online cacophony, who talk about the noise of our digital migration and how exhausting that is. And it is, in fact, your brain is doing this work to sift through all of those signals, whether they're auditory or not. There's more than metaphorical connections between that sort of noise and the auditory noise that is distracting us. If you looked at the Venn diagram, many of these digital pieces will chime at us and ping ringtones, etc., but not all of them. But still, they are, you know, both degrading and depleting the bandwidth that we have to focus on things, and it is work to sift through it all.
So I've always wondered why nobody, maybe I should do this, has written a book about the impact, how smartphones have changed humanity. I mean, absolutely beyond, I think, any hope, unless we have massive problems with energy, in which case we might not be able to have phones. But irreversibly. And I'm just plotting just a few observations. For example, when phones first came out, smartphones, uh, people would use them with some sort of, you know, acknowledgement there are other people in the world around you, and even use headphones. But now, if, for example, you get on the T, which I did a couple of weeks ago, everybody is playing out their own individual soundtrack of life, whether you want to hear it or not. And this is the new normal. It used to be if someone did that, you'd say, "Excuse me, would you mind turning that down, or would you put your headphones in?" You daren't do that now because this is the norm. And so I see this changing gradually, incrementally, behavior. Sound, of course, is in fact impacting health, but it's massively impacting behavior. And teenagers that go to bed and they have their phone under their pillow, and if it goes off, immediately respond. It might say 1 o'clock in the morning, 5 o'clock in the morning. So their whole pattern of normal sleep and everything is interrupted.
Yeah.
Uh, it's
Well,
I find it incredibly interesting.
one thing I think about, and I talk a bit about it in the book, is how much we value a shared sonic space, how
Mm.
much we think about it. We have now, a wonderful technology of noise canceling headphones, which I have a pair of and use constantly. I think they are a great benefit, uh, but they will kind of lead me and others to sort of decide that we should just shut out the world, that the best thing is just to have our own soundtrack, as you say, and that's what matters. We can tune it and select whatever music we want to hear. And if there's something we don't want to hear, then we crank up the noise canceling piece of it, and there we are. Hear what you want. Uh, I think that we need to keep in mind that we still live in a shared sonic space most of the time, and to respect that and to do what we can to make it as good as it can be. It will never be perfect. It will never please everyone. But I think if we neglect it, then we run into all sorts of trouble, noise wise, which has these cascading impacts on our health.
So I'm going to play devil's advocate here for a
Hmm.
moment. So the other day I was out walking my dog, and there was a guy walking along, and he didn't have earphones on. Most people now have big earphones on when they walk. and they're in their own, Idaho. But this guy was walking along and the music was playing out of his handheld phone, quite tinny, but he liked it. And I said to him, "You're missing the bird song." And he laughed. And to me, what you're saying is so true. You're retreating into an alternative world, um, which but just by the doing of that, you're not engaging, you're isolating, you're cutting off the possibility of interaction, personal interaction, and you're missing the birds and a few other things. Not to mention the fact that when people drive like that, it's highly dangerous. And I see a lot of people driving with big headphones on. So I don't know where we're headed with that. I mean, is it
Mhm.
that the possibility of interacting with another human being is such an anathema now that we have to have this like what do you call those pacifier things? These are little pacifiers are on our ears now, right?
That's when I'm in my less hopeful moments. I do think that way. But I'm more often in a hopeful moment. I see so many people who are working on soundscapes in hospitals, with soundscapes in restaurants, who are talking about creating healthy indoor environments, and the desire to have those is growing. I think people who are working on those different areas are finding one another and realizing that they are confronting a kind of a common hazard of neglecting sound when we have our when we're building our built environments. Um, so I am more hopeful, but I do recognize what you're talking about for
Mm,
sure as something
mm,
that keeps me up a little bit, and thinking, oh well, maybe people won't think it's worth the bother, since we can all retreat if need be.
mm, mm. But anyway, there's some fascinating observations and research in the book about how people behave in office space and what has kind of pushed us into these open plan spaces that were so progressive and everybody was going to be, like in la la land together, when in fact, it's caused more sick leave. People are absent more often when they're in those spaces than if they work in individual space or at home. Um, Also, the distraction factor, they're not as productive. So productivity's hit. You would think that economists would say, "Hey, we've got to do something different here. This is productivity's dropping off." So we're kind of going against the grain in some ways. And I know it was driven by economics. It was cheaper to cram a load of people into open space than to give them even their cubicles. The old cubicles are gone. Um, so
Yes. Well,
but in your book, you do say Finland is the only country that actually, what is it called? It's got a law for the amount of space you have to have between workers in a
right.
working environment.
So they have two things going on. One is that they require, an acoustic assessment of new office space, speech privacy, speech transmission uh, index, and that's a measure of speech privacy. So long ago, in the '60s, the Cambridge acoustics firm Bolt, Bernick, and Newman, very famous firm, decided to kind of get to the heart of what interior acoustics problems really were. Up until then, people were really thinking about loudness. Everything is just sort of startling people. It's too loud everywhere. They went and interviewed people in all sorts of workplaces and found that speech privacy was their number one concern. And what that means is that people were worried about being overheard, and or that they were distracted by overhearing other people. That this was, and continues to be, the primary complaint that people have about indoor acoustics. Uh, so this is, been known for quite some time as an issue in the acoustics world, but in terms of what drives interior office planning, it has not really been addressed. In Finland, they added this other thing called distraction distance, which was a metric that a researcher named Valtteri Helmgisto came up with, which is basically this measure of how close you can be working to a coworker before you are distracted. And it's distraction measured in, the speech transmission index when it falls below 0.5, which just means at that point, things are garbled enough that you are not going to be overhearing anything that you can really latch onto and be distracted by. So these two measures have been kind of adopted in Finland as kind of really important for designing office space. One of them is required, and one of them is just a sort of a measurement that they've adopted.
The other thing I know, I don't know if they have this here, but I know in England they have noise abatement officers. And if you have a problem with someone playing really loud music after 11 o'clock or partying, and it's waking up your baby or the dog or whatever, you just call this number and they come out and measure it. And if it's above a certain measure, you get a ticket. And if it happens again, you get a fine. There's actually a system operates. I mean, I don't know how much it prohibits, repeat offending, but at least there's a kind of a modicum of acceptance of you're part of a community and there are other people living in the community and you have to, respect that when it gets late, people need to sleep. They go to work, they have to get up.
Well, there are those local municipal noise codes here in the States. And one of the issues with them generally is that depending on who's making the noise, then that will indicate you have to contact a completely different department of the city, for instance. And it might be the licensing board, it might be the Department of Environmental Protection, maybe it's the police. And so there's a lot of kind of I don't want to call it passing the buck, but a lot of confusion when it comes to who actually should be your go-to for noise. In the States, in terms of federal oversight, there used to be an office in the Environmental Protection Agency called the Office of Noise Abatement and Control. Actually, it's still there. It's just not funded. It
Oh, is
worked
this the
for,
one Reagan did away
yeah,
with? Or, yeah,
yeah,
got
Reagan
funding.
defunded it. So it was working for about a decade. It started right when the EPA itself started, but now is no longer. And so it's sort of more than anything, I think we've lost this sense of noise being a collective problem, that it's not
It's your
just,
individual. Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah. Well, going back to the areas of life, we talked about the classroom that might be noisy. And then we've got this sonic chaos in hospitals, which we're all unfortunately very familiar with when you go into a hospital these days, all these electronic machines beeping and bopping. And there's a wall of sound that you have to kind of endure if you're, certainly if you're admitted, which disturbs both your sleep and your recovery, I would have thought. So today we were hoping to have you feature an anesthesiologist in the book, very interesting man, Joe Schlesinger. He's an anesthesiologist at Vanderbilt University Medical Center, but he's also a professional jazz musician. Talk about multi-talented. So he's kind of like merged those two areas of his life very productively, both for himself and for the medical field. In the book, he talks about the fact that he became quite aware, acutely aware, since his job is protecting people's lives in what are now noisy environments because people in the operating room like to play their favorite music and it can be quite loud. And he wanted to minimize physician error because you can not hear something or not notice something because of all the other noises going on. So anyway, he partnered with another anesthesiologist in Montana, and they've created this thing called the Canary Box, which has really quite improved efficiency in the OR. Do you remember a bit about how that works?
Yes. So
I
it's
can't
actually,
remember.
well, Joe Schlesinger, he noticed this issue in operating rooms. He and many anesthesiologists They are constantly listening to the patient monitors while, the patients are under anesthesia, and especially when they are coming out of anesthesia, they have to start breathing on their own. And so one thing they're listening for is this pulse oximeter, which kind of tracks how much blood oxygen the patient has, and the heart rate. And what they're listening for is the pitch of that pulse oximeter, and it's a certain pitch when everything's great. And then if it starts to dip, then there's problems. Uh, his response was that, well, maybe what we need to do to deal with this distraction is to give physicians a sort of multisensory training to help them be able to kind of distinguish the noise from the things that are distracting them. So he instituted this, and it did have some effect in terms of experimental results. But when he published this, another anesthesiologist, Alistair McDonald, in Montana, read that, and McDonald had actually had a patient almost die on the table due to too much noise in the operating room when he was trying to remove the breathing tube. Patient was fine, but he thought, instead of trying to train doctors to try to ignore distraction, what if we did something about the music that is in the operating room? And he knew that the answer was not to just ban music. When clinicians are doing these long, hours-long operations, the music is something that they value quite a lot. It keeps the energy up. Banning it was not the answer. He thought, well, what if we had a device that interacted between the patient monitor and the sound system of the operating room, so that if a problem was detected with blood oxygen levels, for instance, it would turn off the music. And just like the canary in the coal mine, the silence itself would be an alarm, and also give the team the space to focus on the problem.
Great idea. And then he also came up with another idea, which somebody didn't have a great experience. I can't remember the person's name. It's a Japanese patient, of being in hospital for a long time and very disturbed by all the cacophony of noise, and was thinking about what would be the last sound I would hear if I was dying. And I don't want it to be one of these do 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 things. So they came up. It was quite a protracted procedure, wasn't it, to get 6 different vital sign sounds attached to the various monitors. Well, you can explain it better than me, I bet.
Well, sure. So this was Yoko Sen, and she is a sound designer that works with hospitals, healthcare facilities, and she was hospitalized for a long period of time. She had read an article by neuroscientists that speculated that hearing is the last sound or the last sense to go before we die. And she was thinking about all the beeps constantly. She was inundated with them to the extent that her husband was visiting and flagged down a nurse to try to see what was wrong, and the nurse just said, "Oh, don't worry about that. It just beeps." And this idea
Yeah,
that
we don't use it, like it doesn't matter. Yeah.
doesn't matter. It's just one of those things that beeps. And so she decided that she would work with hospitals on their soundscapes. And in doing so, she was contacted by some folks at Philips, who have a patient monitor that has been developed over the years with millions of dollars of R&D over decades. And they came to discover that they had not actually dealt with the sounds that these things make since 1981. They tracked down a cassette tape that had the sounds. And the 6 sounds that you referred to are the sort of 6 vital sounds, 6 vital signs alarms. If there's the medication is run out, or the pulse oximeter, et cetera, they refer to as the 6 ways people die. So these are very important sounds. And what she's focused on, and what I think a lot of people in this space are focused on, is how do we not just quiet these alarms, but optimize them? Because they are very important. They're important to to the lives of the patients, and just to help the clinicians do their work. They need to hear these, and they want them to not be cluttered by all the false alarms, all the machines that just beep for no particular reason.
And the
Uh,
doctors themselves suffer fatigue, alarm fatigue, or Joe says, right?
oh
They them,
yes,
yeah.
it's you can only be on high alert so much, and the research that I think speaks to this really well was done at Children's Hospital in Philadelphia, where they were tracking. It was very elaborate. They tracked all of the alarms that went off in the critical ward and also the general ward, and then they sort of judged whether those alarms warranted clinician intervention or not. And then they looked at response times to the subsequent alarms. And so what they found was basically the more alarms that happened that were sort of nuisance alarms in the preceding 2 hours before an alarm that mattered happened, the slower the response would be. And so, it's a
Mm.
serious patient safety issue. It does contribute to clinician fatigue and burnout. Um, and so Yoko was working with Philips to try to improve their alarms to make them uh, take up less cognitive
Or
bandwidth.
musical. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly.
Or musical. I mean, it's funny. Again, I was on the T a couple of weeks ago, and it was a new carriage on the Red Line. All the bells and whistles. And I was very surprised that when the doors were doing their business to close, the noise, I swear to God, it was exactly the same machine sound that you get from a cardiac monitor in the hospital. Do, 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 do. And it sped up when the doors were shutting and it was slowed down when and I thought, did they ever think about another sound, any other sound in the world, a xylophone, bring, or something that
Yeah.
would be pleasant to the ear? And I think you're right. The fact that Philips hadn't really considered anything since the 80s sort of speaks volumes, right?
Well, yes, and there's also a great story about the London Transport Authority, who they have been making the transition to electric buses.
Right, yeah.
So, as we all know, one of the main sources of noise that bothers people, topping many lists, is vehicle noise, traffic noise. And electric vehicles, as they kind of slowly supplant internal combustion engine, uh, they are so quiet at low speed that you need to add noise to them to make them, so that people, for the safety of
Yeah.
pedestrians. And when the Transport Authority put out a call for this noise to acoustics firms and sound designers, they met with this one firm, and the people there asked them, well, what do you want the sound to be? What do you want it to sound like? What do you want these buses to sound like? And they said, well, we don't know. We haven't thought about that at all. It's basically we know the regulations say that it has to be two tones, a certain decibel level, and they should the pitch should go up or down depending on whether the bus is accelerating or not. And that was the extent to which they thought about it. And where we have these iconic buses that stitch together London, street by street, and if they all become electric with this sound, they're going to be a major component to the soundscape, and they hadn't given it a thought.
But they did solve it, and it took them a few years, right?
That's right. They did eventually get into it, and they brought stakeholders in, people that were, having hearing, vision difficulties, who would be most in need of hearing these sounds for their safety, cyclists also, um, elderly people, and also people that really didn't want to, had little use for the sounds, which would be, the drivers of the buses, for instance, who would have to hear them all day long. And together, through various iterations, they would play these sounds within a context of kind of a larger street soundscape, and work their way through kind of what were the sounds um, that conveyed, many, many things about there was a bus coming, that if it conveyed a bus was coming, was it annoying? Yes, no. How could we improve it? And then they would improve it, and then they would play it again, and they would keep doing this.
Well, that's market research, isn't it? You
Yeah,
know, and they got there in the end, I think.
they got there, and I think the beauty of it being that they recognize that this is not going to be a sound that everybody loves. It's a sound that, some people won't like, but other people will eventually get tired of it. And then it can be changed. These are designed
Right,
sounds.
right. It's not set in stone.
Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, yeah. I think that's a very good thing. Okay, we got a question from somebody here. You mentioned this in your book, a bit anyway. This woman says, I have a mild degree of misophonia. Repetitive, irritating noises cause me anxiety and the feeling of being trapped. There's no way to cope with this except by wearing noise-canceling headphones, staying away from people, or taking medication. And obviously, the meds do not affect the environmental noise, just the way I feel when I hear them. I don't find any of these options to be feasible or fair. Does anyone else have this issue? So if anybody else has that issue, please put something in there to link up in the chat. That would be very helpful to this particular woman. I haven't got her name. Um, okay, so let's another thing. We've got quite a few things to still cram in here. There's a lot in the book.
Let me mention one thing for this person who has misophonia.
Oh yeah.
She's absolutely right. There is no cure for it. What there are various coping strategies, and some work for some people and don't work for other folks. There is a research group out of Duke. It may be called the Duke Misophonia Center, uh, but they are kind of on the cutting edge of this work. And if anybody has uh, answers, they would be the ones.
Thank you. That's helpful. Um, okay, so one of the things that I thought was interesting is there are some people, you talked about the bus people. We've had two examples from hospital environments where you can improve the soundscape if you do a little bit of diligent work. And it makes a great deal of difference to the people that are particularly in long-term stays in hospital where they're listening to this stuff all the time. Um, but I think other people don't realize that we couldn't remember the exact stats, they're in the book, of loss, hearing loss, which is already happening to young people, above and beyond where it should be for the person's age and other related factors. So I think what is happening is people tend to shout and they're loud, young people, because they've already been going
Mm.
to concerts or constantly playing loud music. When you can hear the music from somebody else's headphones, you can only imagine how loud it is in their head. And so between that and cell phones and posing for cell phones and all that, this projected noise thing just seems again to add to the general background. How can I tune this out? I can't. It's
Yeah.
imposed on you, and that's where the pollution is. It's something dumped on you that you can't get away from.
That's right, and that you can't control. The control piece is a major factor there. When you mentioned hearing loss in young people, I think the stat that I saw was from the World Health Organization looking at listening practices of young people, and they estimated that 1 billion young people are at risk of noise-induced hearing loss from unsafe listening.
Freaky. And yet now we see that very cool rock bands actually they're wearing headphones, a lot of the musicians on stage. So they're aware of their loss already, some of them, or they want
Yeah,
to pretend they have,
you have
right?
to thank Kathy Peck for that. She is a former punk rock bassist. She was with an all-female punk group in the 80s and started to lose her hearing in her 20s, had to get hearing aids, and created a group called Hearing Education and Awareness for Rockers, which is the acronym HEAR. And she dedicated herself to kind of educating musicians that they were putting their hearing at risk. She worked with uh, you know, companies that created those in-ear devices that you mentioned that
Mm,
nobody will go on stage now of any note without them.
mm,
Uh,
mm,
and a lot of people started coming out of, a lot of famous musicians from Eric Clapton, to Eddie Vedder were saying, yeah, I'm losing my hearing too. I'm getting tinnitus too. And
mm.
uh, there's been an increase in hearing awareness classes in conservatories and colleges of music. So I think, when I talked about being hopeful, there is this sort of change in social norms starting from these musicians, and I think spreading to others, that protecting our hearing is kind of like, putting on sunscreen, where,
Right.
it didn't used to be done at all. And then suddenly, parents won't let their kids go outside at all in the summertime without, head to toe. And it's part of every cosmetic that is sold now. So I think that is happening.
Well, I have to say, I've noticed a couple of concerts I've been at, um, people putting those on their children. Whether their small babies should be at these concerts is another matter. But they have these massive headphones on these tiny little babies, not so much on themselves, but they are at least cognizant that they might be affecting the baby's hearing. A couple of success stories. You mentioned the MFA atrium, which, if you live in Boston, the Museum of Fine Art is a wonderful place, and the atrium there is just a remarkable construction. It's an example where Acentech, is it Acentech?
Centec, yeah. Uh,
In Cambridge, thought forwardly, instead of retrofitting the building, which is what many people end up doing with noise problems, which is terribly expensive to try and mitigate noise once you've built the thing. These people design in advance. So could you tell us a bit more about that?
yes. So this was in 2011 that the MFA was creating their new Art of the Americas wing. And in between the old 19th century building and the new one, they build kind of a glass box that was the atrium,
Hmm.
which, so I'll back up just a bit and talk about restaurant noise, which has been growing recently because of a lot of design choices that favor hard surfaces rather
Hmm.
than upholstered ones, getting rid of anything that absorbs sound like drapes or carpets, and putting uh, kitchens in the middle of the dining area, and then, of course, cranking up the music. And so you have this reverberant space. Uh, and if you think about a big glass box that has a stone floor and no dividers in sight, this place
And
looks
steel
like,
cutlery.
yes. And all the people that have just escaped the other exhibits that with their kids, and they're strolling through, and 500 people eating. It should be. Oh, by the way, they also do have piped in music there, so it should be a disaster acoustically. But if you go there and you sit, even at a full lunch service, it's a comfortable 64. When I went, about 64 decibels, you have no problem hearing, and you wonder, how did this happen? Or, if you know the history of restaurant noise, you wonder. And how it happened was that Acentech built a immersive three-dimensional acoustic model of this atrium cafe. They were able to kind of get a what's called an impulse response for the architectural plans of this place, based on, what the materials were going to be, and the layout and the space. And they applied the sound of 500 people eating and talking to it. And then they had the people that were building this space come into their offices and sit, and they were at like a table with pretend services, a plate and knives and forks. And then they played all of this cacophony and said, is this what you're aiming for? Without any acoustic treatments, this is what you're going to get. And of course, no, they wanted to have people, be able to enjoy a conversation over their meal.
Linger.
So they started to add various acoustic treatments, which are really artfully um, camouflaged into the space. And they got it to a point where, you still have that energy, that buzz,
Hmm.
but it's kept at a level that it is not bothersome, that you can still talk to one another. Um, and this is just an idea of how sound aware design, how sort of design by listening can be done. Uh, that was 2011. These models have
Wow.
become much more sophisticated. They are not used as often as they should be. I think they're still kind of a boutique, or, they're for the special clients. Um, but the folks at Acentech believe that they will be used more and more. They're much more cost effective. They
Well, I think
are,
if we acknowledge that
yeah,
noise is a public health hazard. It creates all these problems in the workers, in sick days, in productivity. If we acknowledge that, then it becomes viable as a cost-saving device long term, because it's going to be essential for good design, the same way we worry about air quality and all these other things now, right?
Right.
Uh,
You bring up a great point. I mean, this is there's a group at Harvard called the Healthy Buildings Group,
horrible.
and they talk about, obviously many of the things you would think of with a healthy building, is the ventilation adequate? Are there toxic VOCs coming off of the carpeting? Is there E. coli or something in the water? But they also talk about the soundscape, and is this not just too loud for our hearing, but it is going to uh, stress out the workers. As a whole, sound is part of that package. And if you want to live in a work in a healthy space, it can become a marketable thing to have a sort of maybe a certification that says this is a healthy
Mm,
building.
right.
So that can be an incentive.
Well, you had a nice quote you said. I think you covered it very succinctly. You said the challenge is to harness soundscapes to create more productive workplaces, healthier buildings, and cities with a mix of restorative place, lively buzz, and easy connection. That's very compelling. I'm not quite sure how you do all that.
It's audacious, I understand. And I think people will think this is a call for some sort of perfect soundscape, as if that exists. It's more about avoiding the sort of neglect that our soundscapes have suffered from, to think about sound as a potential resource to help our schools become better places for learning, to help our offices become better places for both productivity, and collaboration. Uh, if we think about these things ahead of time and we are diligent and thoughtful about it, then we can do quite a lot to actually not just make these places sound less bad, but use sound to our advantage as an ally.
Well, I thank you very much for your wonderful book. It's really, really a great read. I also think it makes you aware of a lot of things that we should be paying attention to, testing our ears, safeguarding our good health, making sure that we actually do get a good night's sleep, because a lot of the people that crow about, oh, I sleep like a baby, I've gotten used to all this noise, we find the research doesn't reflect that that's the truth, that these stressors are, when they're unconscious, they're still affecting their health, their heart rate, their cortisol. So they're not getting the deep baby sleep they think they are. So I think once you're aware of this stuff, maybe we can take measures ourselves to make sure we get the best of quiet time, or a soundscape that's harmonious to who we are, and productive in terms of our creativity and our peace of mind and all those things.
Right.
So, Chris, thank you very much for Clamor. Great title. Thank you all for joining us today and for your comments. And I look forward to seeing you all soon. Thank you.